Hello and welcome to Benyo Chats, my personal podcast. If you're curious about the world, this show is for you. How does shareholder activism work? On this episode, I speak to Catherine Howarth. We discuss how Catherine is thinking about her journey into activism and systems theory of change, how to grow back better and be a change maker. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe as it helps others find the podcast. Thank you. Enjoy. Hey everyone, I'm super excited to have Catherine Howarth with me today. Catherine is the Chief Executive of ShareAction. She coordinates civil society activism to promote responsible investment, and she was recognized as the World Economic Forum Young Global Leader in 2014. So Catherine, welcome. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben.
So maybe we could start with just telling us a little bit about your journey into activism, how you kind of ended up in civil society and your route into that.
Absolutely. Well, I feel like the roots of it go quite far back into my childhood, and I have very vivid memories of reading about the suffragettes at school and being very interested and impressed by that. But after university, I wasn't sure, what I was going to do at all. In fact, I had a, not a mini crisis, but, you go through school, you get to university, it all feels like it's all plotted out. And then you come back into blinking out into the big wide world and you've got to make a choice out of a gazillion things you could do with your life. And I found that briefly a little overwhelming. But anyways, I went to live in the East End of London. I grew up in West London. And I went to live in East London. I'd never been to East London. There's no reason as a young person growing up in West London you would ever go to the East End of London, which I never had, despite being a Londoner. Anyway, I went to live there, and then I became involved I'm a Roman Catholic. My mum's Irish, and I grew up Catholic. And so I looked around for a church, and I found this parish church, and incredibly multicultural, amazing place full of people from all over the world. I mean, Catholic parishes in London are one of the most multicultural institutions on the planet, I think. And it was a really interesting experience. And I became involved in an amazing organization just as a volunteer called Telco, the East London Communities Organization. And it was just an amazing bit of luck, really, because Telco was tapped into a set of community organizers in the United States, which had been kind of founded by a really interesting activist and thinker called Saul Alinsky, who wrote an amazing book called Rules for Radicals, which I could recommend. And so I kind of bumped into this very disciplined form, very structured and very thoughtful form of activism, which really thinks about how do you build power, how do you, for low-income communities, for kind of disadvantaged people, and how do you start to, bearing in mind that people in those kind of communities they kind of operate inside their own little community groupings, and in fact, they really need to cross outside of those groupings and connect and figure out what their common self-interests are and then get organized. And they had a brilliant method for doing that. And so, yeah, I just kind of came across this wonderful method of community organizing, and I got really involved in activism. And then I got the opportunity to start the living wage campaign in the UK. And so I left my other job. I was working for a think tank whilst doing this voluntary work, which was really what was inspiring and interesting. And so I became an organizer, a community organizer. And I mean, I remember quite clearly my father thinking, what is she doing with her career and her life, and expressed some concern. And it's true that what the work involved going to Canary Wharf night after night at about 9 p.m. when the cleaners would arrive and all the bankers went home, and talking to cleaners about their lives and beginning to get organized, and then figuring out how we could talk to banks about becoming the UK's first living wage employers. But equally working in hospitals in the East End, talking to cleaners who were on contracts that had been awarded by the National Health Service, and where this kind of outsourcing of contracted labour just resulted in people in the hospital sector having absolutely rock bottom wages and no sick pay. So as a result, they would come into work sick and unwell into the hospital, total public health hazard, just as a result of this kind of logic of contracting and outsourcing. And it was very politicizing for me, all of that. And by the way, it's where I got my first flavor of shareholder activism, which is what I've done for the last 13 years, because we bought some shares in HSBC and in Barclays, and I attended my first AGMs and asked some questions, and just kind of like almost by accident fell into all of that. But anyway, that's how I sort of, those are the roots of it for me.
That's amazing. And I find it's really interesting that there were kind of seeds of your activist thinking from, I guess, quite young. Partly you're saying, you know, never been the East-West London, seeing that mixed community, and partly from reading about the suffragettes, and I guess coming quite early to an idea of theory of change, or how political power can happen, or how can you affect change. And do you think it's been quite formative having a robust or strong model of theory of change about how political power might happen or not? Because I guess you think about, you know, old power structures or incumbent power structures, and they often tell insurgent ideas, oh, you know, not going to work, what are you doing, isn't this crazy? To feel, you know, you have a purpose, but you have, oh, this is a mechanism which might cause this change. Is that been quite powerful for you?
That was essential for me, and I think that any kind of social activism needs the discipline of a kind of a method, or, you know, an explanatory framework for the world, because the world is big and overwhelming, and it's so complex, and you know, each of us is so tiny, and so you really need to think in quite a structured way about how do you have an impact beyond just this unit of one person that I'm at. And that's about operating collectively, and that's about tapping into people's imagination, tapping into people's self-interest, and beginning to make people move together. It's like the power of the shoal of fish, you know, tiny but collectively quite, you know, powerful and able to defend itself. So yeah, for me, it was totally transformational to come across this brilliantly thought through, methodologically sound form of community activism, which placed people and relationships between people absolutely at the heart of it. It was very sort of humane theory, but really effective, and also such inspirational people who were very seasoned, experienced community organizers who used to come and visit from the US, where they were running amazing campaigns in, you know, for example, in the southern western states of the US, where Mexican immigrants were so powerless, but through this approach had organized to get, you know, really basic facilities like, you know, sanitation and waterworks and street lighting and basic things, which in these communities in, you know, the world's richest country, the United States, were not a given at all in immigrant communities in the southern west states, but also in Chicago and other places. So yeah, it was really a bit of a turning point, I suppose, in my life. Although I think you're right that there were things in my upbringing and in my education which laid a foundation and made me, like, at least spot the opportunity and grasp it when I came across that work.
And now at ShareAction, you've got a pretty robust theory of change as well. And part of what appeals to me about it is that there's a sort of element of ownership and direct democracy through it, which is actually an idea which goes across a lot of different sort of systems or power systems. Would you maybe articulate how you're thinking about ShareAction's theory of change today? Whether actually maybe has it been this kind of the same roots over the last 10, 13 years, or has it kind of evolved a little bit in terms of thinking about using of shareholder activism, the vote, and influencing this kind of systemic change, but through a kind of personal change and agency? Although, you know, you guys do group up as a kind of shoal of fish to influence companies?
Yeah, so I mean, well, the thing that attracted me to the work in and around the finance industry and the corporate sector is that, without doubt, companies shape our world day in and day out, and the allocation of capital into companies therefore shapes our world. But what's really interesting about the corporate form is that it is actually, back to its origins, quite democratically organized. So one share, one vote. And that goes back to the fact that people who originally put capital to work in companies wanted their interests represented, wanted to be able to hold directors accountable for the good stewardship of their capital and for the protection of their capital. So those were very kind of rational reasons to sort of establish the foundations of corporate governance, and to ensure that if you put money to work in a company, you had the right to ask some questions, vote the directors in, turn up at an annual general meeting. But of course, a lot of those rights have sort of almost withered on the vine, and particularly in an era of institutional investment becoming so dominant, where big pension funds hold blocks of shares and actually have a very unrelational approach with companies oftentimes. Very unusual for the trustees of a pension scheme to have any interaction at all with the corporate boards or anyone involved in the companies, because it's all lots of chains of intermediation and lots of sort of institutional structures that have got in the way of the kind of more democratic and relational culture which I think business began with, or certain aspects of business began with. So what we've done at ShareAction is just kind of make use of the rights that exist for shareholders to go and ask questions. And also what we've done is quite systematically think about who really wields power in capital markets, which is vast institutional investment organizations, big fund managers and so on. And then try to do quite simple but very useful tricks like ranking them against each other in terms of how responsible they are as stewards of capital, and how much interest they take in the social and environmental performance of the hundreds of companies that sit in their portfolios. And until fairly recently, the investment world turned a pretty blind eye to corporate social and environmental performance, but that's changed very dramatically quite fast. Now, I don't want to be too positive. I think it's a work in progress, but I think that partly because we face such terrifying risks like runaway climate change and chronic loss of species and other challenges that are beginning to kind of, they're driven a lot by business behaviors, but they're also beginning to bite business on the bum in terms of potential financial impacts of those things. And so for a number of reasons, the investment world is waking up. But one of them, I think, is that organizations like ours are doing a better job than used to be done of holding accountable financial sector power for the influence it wields on our world. And yeah, so I mean, those are some of the things that we get up to. And what's really fun, I think, is kind of combining, which is something we do, for example, through shareholder resolutions, combining the power of huge institutional asset managers and pension funds and so on, together with people that basically go out and buy a single share in a company and then bring them together in these kind of lovely, broad-based, quite diverse coalitions in order to take actions like filing a shareholder resolution, which is an amazing right that was, again, really underused, but is starting to come back into its own, where the shareholders of the company have the opportunity to take the initiative and put a proposition to management. And what we've been learning, and by the way, this is all constant experimentation, and that's why I love the job, to be honest, is that it's like, wildly free, and we think, can we have a go at this? And we have a go, and oftentimes we surprise ourselves that it works quite well. But just taking the initiative, putting these propositions forward, combining big investors with little people, and seeing what can be done to channel the power of business in a positive direction, because business shapes our world, and it ought to shape our world in ways that serve the public interest.
Yeah, and I think that innovation on how to use the vote is, really amazing, because in some ways it's almost like a direct democracy form. Imagine if you had it in a country, you're putting forward your own bill, and because you have a stake in, say, the country or the company, you're being able to convince others or not to join you and then vote on it. And I think one of the great things about it is that actually the rights enshrined are generally also accepted by people who might, on the one hand, come from a very, say, free market point of view, because they've always said, yeah, if you own 100% of a company, you can do what you wish with that company, and then obviously in proportion. So actually, even someone not necessarily associated with this, like Milton Friedman, was actually all about shareholder rights. If you own it, then you can do what you wish for it. And the way of resolving what owners, when you have lots of different small owners, of doing it is via this voting process, which is typically an annual process. I was really intrigued by the work you've done on healthy eating and with supermarkets as an example of something which seems to show a lot of innovation about how you can think about that. Would you like to maybe did that come about because someone just had this idea? It's like, oh, how can we do systematic change on healthy eating? Well, there's only a few supermarkets here in the UK. Maybe if we could influence them, we might make a lot of systemic change. Did it come across that, or was it like a coffee conversation, or sort of slowly dawned on people that actually there's this window or this door is opening up amongst corporates to listen to certain other ideas, and let's push on that door?
Well, it's a mixture of influences. So I guess I've always been very, very interested in public health, and then I think the reality is that after years, or hundreds of years, or certainly in the last 150, human longevity has increased and life expectancy has grown a lot, but we're peaking out actually on life expectancy. And in fact, in the UK, women's life expectancy is actually beginning to turn down. And the reason for that is that we're eating unhealthy diets, and the reason for that is that it is sort of cheap and easy to make profits in the food sector by selling foods that are high in sugar, fat, and salt. And collectively, even though we are so advanced supposedly, and our economy keeps growing, we are on a bit of a sort of self-destruct as far as actually human health is concerned. And then, by the way, when along came the pandemic, it's kind of all that was illustrated really profoundly by the fact that people that were obese and overweight and or had other underlying health conditions, all of which are highly correlated with socioeconomic status, were hugely more at risk of death and serious morbidity from COVID. So we just felt like the moment was absolutely right to challenge the UK supermarket sector, which is a highly concentrated corporate kind of landscape with some very dominant players. And Tesco is the largest of the lot and has 27% market share of grocery in the UK. And by the way, during the pandemic, all the supermarkets had been trading because they were allowed, they were given special status, unlike every other business had to lock down, because we do depend upon the supermarkets, and supermarket workers were defined as key workers, absolutely essential to the collective well-being of the country through the pandemic. We just felt it was the right moment to say to Tesco, would you set some serious targets for shifting the health profile of the food and goods sold over the next decade? And bearing in mind that, the minute you walk through the doors of a supermarket, your choices are being shaped in quite sophisticated ways by pricing, by the journey that you travel through, literally through the physical architecture of the shop, by the placing of goods physically high to low. Like, it is not like that you just go in and you decide what you want. Your choices are being shaped. So there's no doubt that the supermarket sector can shape in a positive way our diets. And so that's what we asked them to do. And what was brilliant was bringing investors together to do that. Why? Because if you think about the fiduciary duty of a large institutional investor like a pension fund, their duty is to invest in a way that delivers the best interests of the people on whose behalf they invest. So that's millions of working people who have retirement savings in these pension funds. And that obligation to invest in their best interest has been and continues to be defined really quite narrowly as maximize the financial returns of the portfolio. But if the companies in the portfolio are operating in a way that definitely undermines the best interests, the long-term security, the health and well-being, and the life expectancy of those people, then that's kind of a weird conundrum. And we felt that it was this work on public health is a really interesting way of raising up this debate about how do these big institutional investors define their core obligation to look after your interests? Is it just maximizing returns, in which case you want to invest in supermarkets that sell the maximum amount of profitable, high in fat, sugar and salt products? Or is it more in the best interests of those millions of pension savers that you invest in supermarkets that make great profits, but don't do it at the expense of the health of the very people that those pension funds exist to look after? So I just think it was a great campaign because it was successful, and Tesco agreed to what we wanted. So yay. Nothing like a successful campaign, but also illustrates and begins to unearth a much more interesting and deep debate about the purpose of big, powerful investment organizations who have this job in our society of investing money on our behalf and for our best interests, and where I think there's much scope to challenge the underlying premise and basis of a lot of their decision making and open it up in a way that really does serve our collective interests.
And how do you decide what sort of topics or areas to tackle? Because they're kind of so many. I mean, my reflection is obviously climate is very much in the news at the moment, and it's very good that a lot of people are working on it. But in some ways, that actually leaves the question of something like health, which actually obviously has now also risen. It's something I've worked on for quite a long time. But actually, arguably, for instance, this Tesco and health win, which has been a great win, has made a lot of short and long-term impact, which I think is kind of quite interesting. Whereas arguably, along a lot of dimensions of climate, how shall we put it, we're lagging, as a collective, right? No one individual will fault on that. So I'd be interested to see how you'll think about some of these big topics. Obviously, there's some frameworks like sustainable development goals, and there's a lot of things we can think about what's important to us: education, health, environment, and things like that. I have no answer. I'm just really intrigued as to how a great thinker like you might think about it.
Well, when we pick topics, there's a few criteria. There's some really pragmatic ones, like ShareAction is a registered charity, so we have to find money for everything we do. So someone needs to be willing to fund it. That's one totally pragmatic criteria out there. But there are also the other two, the things that are really at work for us when we think about what to work on is, first of all, will this build the movement for responsible investment? So we know that in order to really create systemic and positive transformational change in capital markets and capitalism and in the business community, lots of people need to be on board with that and really need to own it, be excited about it. So it's one thing to work on climate change, but it's great to also work on health, because there's different people for whom that really lights them up when it comes to thinking about these themes. And it's been amazing actually to see how on the climate agenda, climate activists have become so interested in what's going on in financial markets and how is climate finance being handled by big financial institutions and companies. But equally, I think there's great potential for the whole galaxy of people that think about health, includes everyone in working professionally in the health field, doctors and nurses and community health practitioners, but also people who patients and their families and so on. But for a whole additional constituency of people who maybe aren't really like all turned on about climate change, but really are thinking about health, to also start thinking and questioning the role of finance and capital markets and companies in shaping our health outcomes. So building the movement and growing always a bigger, more inclusive and more diverse movement of people that find these things interesting and relevant to them is part of the criteria. And then the other one is, where are the issues which start to kind of, as I was talking about earlier, like nudge you into a slightly deeper set of questions about the internal logic in capital markets and the purpose of large institutional investors and how they define their purpose, how accountable they are to their stakeholders, who they conceive as their stakeholders. So that's another thing. I think when our campaign is going really well, there's a sort of like, you know, there's the drama of the campaign. A shareholder resolution, it's quite media friendly. It's a bit of a fight between shareholders and management, and it's fun and it's got drama. But there's something else going on at a deeper level, which is it's raising some deeper questions, and those are good campaigns that sort of do have all those ingredients woven in.
And how would you convince someone who's sort of open-minded, but say a little bit skeptical of either your theory of change or even some of the topics you're doing? So someone you'd meet would be open-minded to try and convince them to your cause.
So there are people that are complete and utter skeptics, and I think we can just not worry about those people. The people I'm interested in are the ones who are kind of nascent but apathetic supporters, and because in order to create change, you really do need a base of support. You need deep support, and what you want to be doing all the time is switching on people who are kind of potentially engaged and supportive, but are just a bit busy with something else, other causes, other issues. And the art of this is partly through switching people on intellectually, but much more experientially, building a bigger, deeper, and more powerful base of support. And I think you could not worry about the real skeptics, because, you know, there's people that will always be just antagonistic. I'm not worried about them. What I am concerned about is building more support around this work and tapping into the latent but apathetic silent majority.
I'm reflecting just on that. I think at least that's where, for me, storytelling or narrative, I think you've touched on this, is actually extremely powerful for people. Maybe it's a part of being humans. This is more sort of personal for me, but for instance, I've read quite a lot of Ursula Le Guin, and I actually think from that, my understanding of feminism, particularly when I was younger, was probably most enriched by deep thinking about her work than maybe reading either articles in a newspaper or, you know, or like sort of social critical theory, of which it wasn't really my thing and wouldn't really understand. So I was interested. What do you think that maybe narrative or story has a place for things within activism, or has it informed any of your world?
Oh, absolutely. By the way, Ben, you got me into Ursula Le Guin. I never read any of her work.
Oh, really? You're a latecomer.
Several of her wonderful books. So, that's all about you. So, thank you for helping me discover the great Ursula Le Guin, and also some of her videos. She did some great videos, not totally unlike the format we're talking in today. Bit less of a conversation, bit more just her, but like, what an amazing woman. And by the way, I'd love to have further conversation. Maybe we'll have this offline another day about the deep thinking you've done about her work, because I just really gobbled up her books and thoroughly enjoyed them. I'm not sure it got into deep thinking. But in any case, absolutely, storytelling's so important. And it's partly the stories we tell collectively about the endeavors we undertake together, but it's also the stories that people start to tell about themselves when they've been involved in action. I really believe in the power of activism to kickstart a process whereby people tell a different story about themselves. They tell a story about themselves as a protagonist that took on corporate power, or took on, you know, political power, and it's really through action that we become who we are. And that kind of conscious action for a greater good is a particular type of action that's very profound for people. And so I think it's really important, and community organizing was particularly good at this. And so my kind of apprenticeship, which was 10 years long, in community organizing before I kind of formally came into this work, was really the kind of foundation block of everything I try and do in some ways at ShareAction. But it was particularly good at having people articulate, you know, how they feel about the action they've been involved in, what it means to them, how it changes who they are. And also, of course, then we have collective stories about, we won this battle, or, you know, we won this campaign, and that's really exciting, and it forms part of the collective narrative. But that personal narrative piece is great too. And it's not just the story you tell about yourself, but it's also the story you tell about other individuals. So one of my favorite stories is of a young woman who was a wheelchair user, who came on some of ShareAction's kind of training in you know, the art of a good question at a company's annual general meeting. And she was a poet, actually, and also a really good athlete, and a wheelchair athlete, and just a generally kick-ass young woman, phenomenal. And she went to the annual general meeting of National Express. It was a bit of more than a bit of a hassle. It wasn't a disabled access venue, by the way. So she had to kind of come in, humiliatingly enough, through a sort of service entrance. And but she made it onto the floor of the annual general meeting, and she told her story about you know, standing at bus stops. This was the National Express annual general meeting, which is a big bus company in the UK, listed company, and about how that, you know, they wouldn't give her access onto the bus, and there would be, you know, push chairs and so on, which could be folded, and they were given priority over people, wheelchair users. And she told her story, and she challenged the board, and they changed the company's policy there and then, because she was so compelling and it was her story. And then she got to tell the story of her AGM success. So those are the best, I think, when people bring their own story to bear, and then it becomes a new part of their story, that they got something changed, and then everyone can absorb that story, and off you go.
Yeah, it becomes part of the, I always like to say, it's kind of the myths that we like to tell ourselves. You know, money is a human myth, intersubjective myth that we use for all of these things, and we have to tell ourselves the kind of new stories, the new myths in a good way for what we want to do. This might be a little bit micro, but it's just occurred to me in terms of what poetry has taught me, or at least when I was very young, I was taught by a certain brilliant Mrs. Howarth some poetry, and one of the things that she taught me was never to overuse adjectives and the power of the verb, particularly in poetry. I don't know, do you have any micro thing or even macro thing about what humanities or poetry has taught you?
Gosh, I'm so glad that my mum was your teacher, and I love the fact that you're so generous about the influence she had on you. And it's funny because she's still she's 76 now, and she's still volunteering in primary schools, helping children learn to love poetry, which is really lovely. And I feel very humbled by my mum's kind of grasp of poetry, because my own is quite feeble in comparison. So yeah, I mean, I do draw on poetry here and there, and I'm trying to get my own children to engage with it. And it's really interesting. They love poetry. They find it just, I don't know, the meter or something about it. Particularly my second son, who's not an amazing, he's not such a keen reader, but he really, really tunes into poetry. So I think we need more poetry in the world. That's all I can say. And I love the fact that it's been so formative to you. You're like a hugely successful fund manager and figure in the finance sector, and poetry's there in the background, stirring it up and helping you. So we should have more poetry in all of activism. And it's some organizations draw on it more. We're not doing a good job of that. ShareAction, I'd say. Maybe one resolution out of today's conversation would be more poems.
Well, maybe I have a really good friend who actually, his other job, he always says poets have two jobs. This is Rishi Dastada. Actually had a chat with him a few weeks ago. So you're always poet / someone else, poet / pension fund manager, poet / copywriter, which has been there for a couple of thousand years. And he points out that poetry is still one of the oldest arts, and it seeps into everywhere because of the power of the word or language. Things which you might not call poetry now, if you think about it, probably is poetry, but it's in disguise. We don't want to tell anyone that it is necessarily poetry. And I partly refer to it because, like you were hinting to, some of these seeds or sparks that we get when we're very young somehow really grow with us. And I've always said, actually, there's been quite a few handful of my teachers to be able to be grateful to them, because they often really don't know the influence they have. You're casting pebbles in the pond and they ripple, or seeds through the garden, and you don't know what takes root. And actually, you probably, the vast majority of the time, you will never know that. That's the nature of that. Yet I think they are very transformational. And I actually think it's the same with some of your work. You are planting a lot of seeds and ideas, and sometimes you have these big win-wins. But even when you don't have those successful campaigns, you are making, well, in the truth to power aspect, you're making powerful people think. You might not be able to convince them of that, but then that next layer down in the ecosystem, you're making a lot of other people think, whether they're engaged general public or other people within policymakers and things. And I think that's an area of influence which is essentially impossible to measure. You'll never really be able to measure it. But I think it's increasingly, it's always been really important, and I can really see it, and I can kind of see it in your work, and I see it broadly also in the work of teachers on this individual personal agency, but where this systemic changes and translate it into policy speak. They've got this idea of this so-called Overton window. This is a window where policy action can happen because it's acceptable to enough people. And a lot of this engaged activism, or really just talking about the challenges we face without having to put labels on it, moves where this policy or where the system can be. And I think we've seen this in social change movements throughout time, whether that's minority rights, disabled rights, women's rights, the ending of slavery, or all sorts of manners of things like that. And it's this, I don't know, intersectional between this change.
There are so many powers. Before we move on from teachers, just want to ask if you've read the book Kids I Taught and the Things They Taught Me.
Yes, I have.
Such a good book, isn't it?
It is brilliant.
I really loved that. Was a reading highlight for me of last year. And it's about a poetry teacher and her reflections on as the title says, kids she taught and the things they taught her. And it's just so wise and so funny and touching about children in different parts of the country and different communities and the cultures they came from. And it's just an absolutely beautiful book. But
yeah, she had also very amazing parents. I don't know if you read her essay, but they had traumas over the pandemic, and both her parents passed. But her, if I recall correctly, her father on the certificate, it was died from a broken heart. There's an actual medical term for it, which is part of this essay she's written. So if you haven't read the essay, it's incredibly moving.
I'll make sure to read that. That's a great recommendation. I was just going to tap into, you mentioned about kind of the cycle of social change and movements for social change, and I talked about the suffragettes at the very beginning of our interview. And one thing that really was a real kind of interesting eye-opener for me was, because one of the things that ShareAction's tried to do is make the case that pension savers, of whom, you know, every working person is one in the UK, thanks to pensions automatic enrolment, which came in about 12 years ago or so. So before that, pensions were kind of a bit of a kind of slightly privileged workforce benefit for the more kind of mid-ranking employees and middle managers and upwards. And then the government decided, gosh, everyone better be a pension saver, because we're kind of worried about the fact that the nation doesn't save enough and what will be the implications for public finances. So everyone, you know, working in McDonald's, working cleaning jobs, is now a pension saver, which means they have a stake in capital markets, they're share owners. One thing that ShareAction has been campaigning for fairly unsuccessfully, I would say, and we've had some, I mean, you've talked very kindly about our wins, but an area where I think we've got a long way to go is in the kind of democratization of the system. And what we've been arguing for is that pension savers should have more rights to have a say about the policies that govern their investments. They should be, they should have access to information about what holdings the money is put into, and how votes were cast at company annual general meetings by the fund managers that invest on their behalf, and just to open up the space a bit so that the actual real people whose money is have a little bit more agency and opportunity to question and so on. And so we've been making that case for a long time, and I've been kind of keeping a little track of the arguments that are put up for why that's not a good idea, and they literally perfectly mirror the arguments that were made by why women should not have the vote over 100 years ago. It's like, well, you know, they wouldn't really know what to do with that information. They wouldn't really know, they're not really interested. You know, all these arguments, which are exactly the reason why, you know, women shouldn't have the vote, because they wouldn't really know, you know, how to vote sensibly, because they're only women and they're not really educated, which is basically stupid, what people obviously say about ordinary working people, and why they couldn't be let into the mysteries of investment management and capital markets. And they're not really interested again. And so, like, it's just been so interesting that I think these movements to democratize and open up spaces of power, whether it's capital markets today, which, let's face it, is an incredible nexus of power in 21st century world, or 100 years ago, Parliament, and you know, women having the opportunity to elect people to represent them in Parliament. It's just the same set of arguments. Why not? And I find that really interesting as to why we shouldn't give up, and why probably people look back and say, of course, people should have had more opportunity to have a say and be part of the story. But that's not the way the world looks at it right now, and particularly the professionals that are in charge of our money.
So I think a lot of the philosophical challenges are essentially smokescreens. I don't think they really hold up if you poke them very, not even very hard at all. Like we're saying, like your analogies to the women's vote. But I do think there is an issue of who would pay for a lot of this and some of the infrastructure issues. But I think that hopefully should be a diminishing problem because of where technology can come in. So arguably 20 years ago, if you had to do this by paper and post, you would probably quite have strong bureaucratic sludge money arguments on the other side. But I think there's an Apple II or things coming through that. And actually, there's quite a powerful other theory of change about how transparency can breed positive things for the system, partly whether you view that through a check and balance you know, if you look back at the pandemic, if we'd had more transparency on government decision making and policy, because you had outside experts to look at it, our decision making arguably could have been better. And then there are these other arguments, like you say, about rights of what people could do with their information, and actually the kind of wisdom of the crowd idea when they have that information out in the domain is usually pretty powerful. So I would be hopeful, but I do think there is an issue around, you know, none of the incumbents particularly want to stump up any money for it. So unless government either does or forces that, is less likely to be able to happen, because there is a reasonable amount of a kind of money issue. But there are actually a lot of other second order benefits for building up some of that infrastructure of saying who's got votes and rights and things. And particularly if part of the theory of the world is that the corporate form or the ownership of the corporate form is becoming a more powerful stakeholder in the world, or is recognition of the power that it definitely wields, then having transparency into who ultimately owns or is voting or saying on that power then becomes more important. And then that will allow, at the moment, that I think there is a clog in the system as to, you know, if you own a tiny piece via an intermediary and another intermediary and another intermediary, being able to get your vote, which ultimately you do own, although you might have delegated it to somebody else, to getting that back. You know, there is a plumbing kink in order to do that, and that would take this infrastructure charge. But I do think there's a case that you could make to government and the powers that be to do that, to get that through.
Yeah, well, as I said at the very beginning, you know, companies were designed quite democratically to start with, but then we didn't have intermediaries. People put money in, and they were rich people, and they insisted on having rights to hold accountable directors. And now we have poor people who own shares with no rights to hold anyone that looks after it accountable. So there's a way to go. I think technology absolutely is a friend here, but I mean, that's a bigger, deeper conversation about, is technology a force for good, or, you know, inherently progressive? I think it all depends on the ethical and human and power related structures we put around them, and the governance. And so the technology is certainly there to do this. But it absolutely, you're right, that I think large pension funds won't volunteer. The argument will have to be made in Parliament and in policy circles that almost, you know, having put in place automatic enrolment and enable millions of people to have a stake in the system, which, you know, is in a way a kind of right-wing politician's dream. I mean, I think, you know, Mrs. Thatcher was always very keen on this idea of shareholder democracy, and that's right, because it should be. Capitalism should be opened up for everybody, and should operate in everyone's interest, but it won't operate in everyone's interest until we have more accountability and democratic structures propping it all up, and we don't have those yet.
Yeah. So I think there's a really good analogy on that for making the case between kind of housing and this, you know, rightly or wrongly, you can have this notion of like right to own your house. I don't know whether that's true, but obviously in England, in the UK, there is a definite philosophical movement on that. You could say whether it started with Thatcher or not. Well, actually, that's a kind of piece of capital asset idea, which really readily translates to this cousin idea of owning a piece of a company of where you are, and particularly now with automatic enrollment. I think this technology piece is really interesting as well, because, for instance, the information that we give to the large technology players is kind of amazing, and we sort of semi-willingly go into that. But the transparency or the data that we're prepared to give to government, the narrative around that seems to be much more worried. So we're much more worried, for instance, about giving up some NHS data, which is meant to be used for our good, than we are giving, quite frankly, you know, the technology companies know vastly more about us than actually the NHS ever would. And then the NHS would be, my belief would be, it'd be governed much better. Like, you can argue about it, that, but you would put these things in place and much more accountable. And it seems to me that the system, whether that's government or civil society or however, hasn't made the case to the people to saying, we will use your technological health data for good. We will be able to save costs and make you healthier, in which case data transparency and the technology is obviously going to be a force for good, rather than just sending you angry memes on social media, right, which is not really doing you any good, but somehow you think you're going to give away that data for free. And I think there is this similar thing. If you get people to saying, look, you own a piece of the supermarkets and these companies and things, and you can use your voice for an act of good in that sort of same way. But there's a kind of more foundational, wouldn't necessarily say educational message, but a new story, a narrative around how technology is enabling you to deck that. And I think maybe this draws in, go on.
Well, I was going to say it's very much the exact same corollary as what I was saying about health and supermarkets. So the role of large institutional investors that hold supermarket and technology stocks on your behalf, if their only obligation and their only purpose is to absolutely just simply maximize the returns from those stocks, then in the case of the technology companies or the supermarket companies whose behaviors have incredibly significant impacts on all of our lives, you just haven't got those questions being asked by the shareholders who act on our behalf. And this is why I think we really do need to open up this debate about the legal obligations of institutional investors and the purpose of their work in relation to the well-being and benefit of the people on whose behalf they act, and legitimize that institutional investors can ask questions of technology companies about whether their policies and practices are beneficial to the people who really own the stocks.
Actually,
it's such an interesting space.
Yeah.
It's
as
so
you talk about them,
exciting.
well, maybe this is a line of work, or maybe it goes more into sort of client earth and things, that there hasn't been a really good test case for a very long time to redefine fiduciary duty, for today. And I think there would be, I can't think of it, but I think there would be a very strong case if we came up to saying that it's shifted from this narrow idea of money to what it might be for broad stakeholders. And because we're relying on essentially case law, and in fact, the original case law for prudent man goes back to, I think, something, I'm slightly mistelling it, but something like a horse and cart incident in the 1600s, where this was based, that there has been any clarification. And now, for those listening in, there is actually quite a lot of work being done with this. The lawyers Freshfields have put out a new report in association with the UNPRI, but that's based on a kind of legal understanding of this. It hasn't been ratified by any case law or any actually judge precedents, even though there's QC and counsel. So people are always a little bit wary because it hasn't actually been tested by the system. And unfortunately, you can't just ask the system, what do you think? But I think there would be some really interesting, obviously that stems to some of the climate litigation you see worldwide using some of these principles. And I think there is that. And there was, in the UK basis, a little bit of case law to do with what the Law Society has said about how we can choose investments or not. But it hasn't gone to the kind of what I would call the steelman argument of sort of saying like, well, if you do something which you can definitively show is bad for a majority of people, I can't necessarily think of what it is, maybe climate related or something, then actually does your fiduciary duty extend when you can see that those same people are the stakeholders that you're representing? Should that somehow take precedence? But it would, in my view, and you can see how you can make the legal arguments around that, it would have to be retested today with how we can view the world today, as opposed to where the case law is, which is actually hundreds of years old.
Well, you could do it through case law, or you could do it through legislation. I mean,
you could do it through legislation.
The reason we have legislators that we elect is that they write laws that are for the common good. And we need a rewrite of the law in this area. ShareAction has published a model bill of parliament, which we call the Responsible Investment Bill, which sets out a new definition of investors' legal duties that encompasses this concept of, there's not a phrase we use in it, but kind of maximising shareholder welfare instead of just maximizing shareholder wealth. And if you go back to Milton Friedman and his arguments, which you cited at the very beginning about, you know, the purpose of the company is to maximize wealth. Well, if you just substitute that for maximize welfare, then you immediately get into a world where companies have to think about whether their own, and in a world of mass participation in pension funds, the public good is actually almost the same as the welfare of the millions of people who have a slither little stake in, you know, hundreds of the world's biggest companies whose actions really do need to serve the public interest more than they perhaps do at present, certainly when it comes to the climate crisis, but certainly I think also when it comes to the public health challenges we face today.
Yeah, and in fact it's not too far an extension for what some of in the Milton Friedman's actual papers, where he would argue if you look after your stakeholders and it's wealth generating, he has no issues with that, externalities with that. So obviously this is a slight step further, but it's actually not too far away from some of his original assertions, particularly if you put it in his place and time for what they were debating.
Indeed, and actually a lot of what he was interested in was sort of disciplining management, actually.
Yeah,
they shouldn't be feathering their own nest.
Yeah.
And I'm all in favor of that. And so, you know, I don't think I'm very far from Milton Friedman.
Yeah, no, it's kind of surprising when you get back to some of what he was dealing with philosophically also at the time. Was there was a lot of, how would we put it, cronyism, which was what he was kind of more worried about than some of these other aspects. So one of these things sort of finally on the big picture before maybe dwelling on a couple more kind of quicker things is it touches on this, and I'm really interested in what you think, which is essentially this debate or conflict to some degree. I think there's maybe less conflict than sometimes between essentially degrowth ideas and, for want of a better word, like techno-optimism ideas or growth ideas. And I guess one of the big challenges, and we sort of said this, you know, can we use technology for good, is that it does seem probably to a lot, but not all economists, that to deal with poverty, whether that's in poor countries, between countries, or within countries, when you look at the deep poor in a wealthy country like the UK, that they'll need to have growth really to be able to achieve that. And so we could talk about equitable growth, as opposed to the problem with some degrowth is it's quite hard to separate within that, and you're not going to be able, well, according to the techno-optimist idea, the innovation and technology to face some of these things like health and climate would not happen without growth. On the other hand, like some elements of degrowth kind of a sort of common sense. So for instance, food waste, you know, in the sense that why would we waste food that you don't have to? Seems common sense, but there's actually a very strong degrowth idea, right? Don't use more than you would do in whether that's the food supply chain or even food on the table. So I was wondering whether this intersects with any of your thinking.
So I'm not a degrowth person, but I'm definitely a better growth person. And you know, I think actually gets back to the ideas we just talked about as maximizing welfare rather than just maximizing wealth. We do need a cleverer version of GDP. And lots of clever people, far cleverer than I, put their heads to sort of working out how we can do that. And I hope we make some progress on it. And
well, actually, New Zealand might be, I was going to say, New Zealand might be getting there, which is also why it's flowing into their policy. They've got a kind of living budget idea, which is trying to put in forms of natural capital, and therefore policy flowing from that. So maybe starting to happen at government level.
Yeah, no, I mean, we're obviously going to need lots of experimentation, and I'd heard that New Zealand was having a look at that. And I'm not surprised because I think they have that incredibly brilliant leader. But yeah, we need to grow within the safe space for human flourishing. And at the moment, the model of growth we've got is, you know, to use a phrase I used earlier, it's biting us in the bum. It really is putting us at risk. But of course, we need growth, particularly in parts of the world where people still suffer a totally unacceptable standard of living and don't have the absolute basic necessities. So 100%, I'm all for that.
Yeah, so I mean, I have to say the current where the pandemic is and what the UK have done on international aid has recently made me a little bit less hopeful, because within, say, a progressive better growth agenda, you would want economic growth, technology transfer, and these types to poorer countries, whether you want to invoke what's happened in the past or not, even just looking at today, partly because of positive spillovers, as well as defeating externalities. And something like climate externality or a pandemic externality, you can't hope to solve without bringing along poorer country counterparts. So that's maybe a little bit less hopeful, but
Yeah,
some of these other things more hopeful. So I didn't know whether we wanted to end, at least on the sort of macro section, with anything you're viewing and maybe potentially more hopeful, or any comments on what we did, or what specifically on the UK and international aid, but actually the fact that in general richer nations are not really helping poorer nations through the pandemic in a way which actually makes, if you were, not that we would have it, but if you had a global government, you would not be doing this, right? Because it's not, it doesn't really win-win for everyone.
No, I mean, vaccine nationalism is literally the perfect embodiment of everything that's wrong, just because it's so short-sighted apart from anything else. Like, we will get new variants of COVID if we don't vaccinate the world at speed. So the idea that you hoard them in your little island is just so foolish and so lacking in moral integrity. I just can't bear it. But anyway, that's the world we're in. Where do I see some hope? Well, I mean, it's one of the reasons the last 13 years at ShareAction has been so fun and joyful, is that actually I see, bits and pieces of much more enlightened thinking at work in corners of the business community and in the financial sector. And I think there's real limits to that. And I think, as I've described earlier, it is critical that we actually have better and more structured ways of holding accountable people that wield significant power in capital markets and financial sector, because their decisions and their policies have huge impacts on all of us. That's why we're interested in the decisions that they make. But the potential for those decisions to be made well and in the public interest absolutely exists. And I think the space of responsible investment is actually quite dynamic, and there is almost a bit of a race to the top going on with, and one could be very cynical and say a lot of it's greenwash, but I do see a dynamic where financial services companies and investment firms are trying to outcompete each other in being good on ESG. Well, long may that last. And also, by the way, very interesting that the Biden administration, I think, seeing all that hot up further, the Trump administration was a bit of was a break on some of that, but we're in a different era. So look, I don't want to be too cheerful, because there's plenty to
some progress.
Be anxious about the world, but I think people are starting to see the incredibly short-termist approach to business management, maximization of profits without any thought to the externalities created and the impact of those externalities on the very people who own the stock in your company. We're beginning to see through how that doesn't really work, and towards something better.
Great. Well, let's end with this kind of short section on a kind of underrated, overrated, with a few quick fire topics, and then maybe some advice to young people or young activists thinking. So for overrated, underrated, we can try a few things. Some of these might be obvious, I guess. So overrated, underrated, cycling.
Underrated.
Obviously underrated. Green, good to go around, although maybe you don't have the infrastructure.
Why? Because it's so delightful to cycle. It's so incredibly productive and efficient and use time, and you can't catch COVID on a bicycle. So, like, all of the above reasons, it's it's smarter, it's nicer, and it's healthier, and it's also cheaper. So stimulus cycling.
Yeah, great. Modern art, maybe art in general.
Overrated. No, not art in general.
No. So modern art overrated, art in general underrated.
Yes. But what do you mean modern art? That's too. Do you mean modern painting?
Yeah, no, okay. More precisely. Yeah, let's say modern painting. Oh, I guess I was maybe slightly hinting towards these digital assets that we've got now that might have heard. I mean, that would be the pinnacle of very modern art, so-called NFTs.
I'm going to sound like an old fart, which I am truly. So yeah, okay, overrated. I'll go for
that. Carbon tax or price or something.
Underrated. Underrated. We need one.
Yes, I completely agree, and I actually think this idea of carbon, whatever you want to call it, tax dividend, and then actually giving that back to the people. I would probably make it means tested, but even not. So some universal benefit, like a sort of child benefit idea, would actually go down because it's, although on the one hand you might tax, the tax might be thought of as anti-progressive, the dividend itself would be progressive and more than weigh that out in my view. But anyway, we're not there yet. But maybe living in cities or urbanism.
Well, great question, because the pandemic's really shifting that. I love it. I'll just speak for myself. It's not underrated with me, but I love a visit to the countryside.
Yeah.
Good for the soul.
So maybe correctly rated. I think obviously they're going through a hard patch now, but I do think they probably have more solutions than problems, which is maybe not.
Yeah, I'm a dedicated city dweller, and I think life can be beautiful in cities, but we do have to work hard on, we all need green spaces. There's lots of potential for green space in cities. We can be way more creative with rooftop gardens and all.
Yeah,
we do
sustainable
need
living.
We do need probably less cars, more trees, and happier cities.
Agreed. Okay, using your vote.
Overrated in the UK.
Right.
Because we need electoral reform. But I think you will have heard loud and clear that I'm a Democrat and believe in democracy on in the course of the conversation we've had. So yeah, underrated probably in general in the world.
Yeah, or at least definitely underrated at the company level. I think that, I broadly agree. I think if if you're a very powerful, notable person, then maybe, your individual vote, you don't think has as much power as it should do from your power in the world. But for the average person, and in the UK, a lot of people aren't voting, and so their voices aren't being heard. So for the average person, I definitely think it's underrated, maybe overrated in some of these niches. And the last one for this one would be, actually, no, I had one more before the last one, which we touched on. What's remote work, which you sort of touched on with the other one with things.
Underrated. It was underrated so much by me. I was a real gotta be in the office person, and I can really thank the pandemic for the fact that I've transformed my view. But that's because I think
forced experiment.
Video calling technology is just incredibly marvelous and clever, and I just think it surely signals a productivity revolution, just because less of us is running around on aeroplanes and won't be doing that anymore. So, and I think it's lovely to be at home. You can pop out and have lunch, in your
very
backyard.
Positive for your local communities, actually. That whole community thing.
Great. There's a good piece in the FT on it today, actually, by Simon Cooper. Anyway, I'm a fan.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the two caveats is there is still value, specific value in face-to-face, but I think we will be able to do that with mostly remote or hybrid anyway. Like my meetup, they don't go away.
Is this not face-to-face? To me, I feel like we're having a lovely conversation. And
I think
I don't think it would be that much better if we were breathing on each other.
No, but we have an advantage that we've got what you would call it, built up social or relationship capital. I do
Okay.
think if we, although having said that, I have done some of these chats with people I've never met. So like this philosopher in Utah talking about gamification, and the benefits way outweigh that. So not only do we get all of the benefits in video, which are probably just as good, is there's no way I would have been able to do that podcast without. So I mean, maybe you are right on that.
I am a fan of the handshake, and I'm a fan of the hug, but I'm also a fan of, and we also really need to travel less and be with our neighbors more.
Yeah, so I mean, and I think it will make go hybrid. Like, let's have a lunch or dinner every 3 or 6 months and meet up and have really fruitful conversations that way, where we need to meet on things with our community. So yeah, I definitely think remote work is going to be about. And the only other second caveat is really good for knowledge workers, but I think, as we alluded to, I don't know how this is necessarily going to help people in warehousing or people where you still need physical infrastructure, and wouldn't want them to be left behind in the way that their productivity might not change. But I don't know. See how that goes throughout.
I hope that we can. One of the things to come out of this pandemic is that we start to value those people more than we did. We talk about underrated people that actually do the essential jobs. So underrated, and we need to, give them more dignity, give them more pay, look after them, and acknowledge how critical they are. And and
to the extent that remote work can actually save some money from our knowledge worker part, then actually giving that to, for want of a better word, economists speak again, giving that to labor as opposed to the capital knowledge part would seem to me to be a fair shift.
You know what we need actually is good old-fashioned trade union organizing in all those roles. I mean, people have to get organized. No one's going to give them anything without them getting together and demanding it. But let's see, let's hope.
Another theory of change. Although, like you say, legislation, minimum wage in the US, argue one way or the other. But okay, last one on this, and then advice would be having children.
Underrated.
Yeah, I agree, underrated. I slightly flip-flopped on this, but I'm now kind of firmly on the view on 2 or 3 things. One is, I think my children have taught me more than I've learned through many other routes. Some of this is thinking also about autistic thinking, but they're generally, and also because I kind of think where we are now, we're going to need a younger, activated generation to get us out of the problems, because I don't see it coming from that older generation. And actually, children are the ones who are going to do that for all of the reasons: curiosity, new ideas, and, as you would hope, the younger generation always does things better, as you expect, than the older generation. And given where we are now, that actually we're going to need more of it than less of that, and that's got to have to overcome any of the other challenges that we're worried about, natural environment things which are there. But they're unfortunately, they're going to have to figure out those things, and we're only going to be able to do it with them and with their presence as opposed to not. That's kind of where I've ended up on that.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yesterday, my son had his last day in primary school. My oldest son had his last day in primary school, and it's an emotional day, saying goodbye to all his little mates. And it's a very multicultural school. The white children are a small minority of the class, and they've had the most amazing education together for 7 years. It's just a very small school, 1 form entry, so there's just 30 in his year group. And they've been on a little journey together for 7 years in primary school, and they've learned so much about the world. I'm just amazed by how beautiful the education is they've had. I mean, they learned all about. He came back from school at age 6 to tell me all about the Sustainable Development Goals. I was gobsmacked. I mean, and they're really enlightened, and they're learning about resilience, personal resilience. They're learning all these brilliant skills, and they're learning that not all is right about the world, and that they can do something about that, and they must do something about that. And I'm just very impressed by the education my boys have had in the local primary school here, and it does make me hopeful. And you're right that kids are going to have to put things right. That we all, I was going to use a swear word, but I won't.
Messed up. Yeah, I completely agree, and I think I was taught about the ozone layer, but nothing around broad sustainability or any of these other issues, which obviously we're now being taught. And I speak to senior managers today in something like healthcare, which is generally quite purposeful. And a lot of them say, yeah, we fell into it. We didn't necessarily think about it. We could have gone into healthcare, or could have gone into advertising, and we've ended up in a big biopharmaceutical company or medical technology company. But they're saying the generation Y or Z that they're speaking to are attracted to them because it is purposeful, that they feel like, okay, this is how we're going to make an impact. And that's a generational sea change about what they're seeing. And then actually this goes into how you attract those sort of people, active people who are engaged, wanting to work in more purposeful type of business, this idea that we can have tech for good or business for good as well. Great. So maybe ending on the final question would be, do you have any advice or thoughts for perhaps younger people or younger activists, or people or activists in general, about what they could be doing in the world?
Wow. Well, I would say read a lot, and not just on Twitter. Try to read outside your bubble. Or social media or Instagram or whatever it is. Read books, listen a lot, especially to people who are outside of your social group, and try and get deeply into something. Practice something. I don't know what it might be. Try and get good, get a little mastery of something or a few things. Keep moving, experimenting. I don't know. I haven't got any advice. I'm so humble in the face of that question. It's just, who knows?
No, that sounds like brilliant advice. Listen, read a lot. Also think outside your box. Be kind of constructively challenged by those who might not be quite like you, or inside your circle, and therefore step outside of your comfort zone a little bit. I had an improv master talking about that in terms of that practices as well. And then I think this idea of deep mastery on something that you're really interested in, knowing something, or to the extent that you can know a lot of things, are really helpful. Because I think nowadays, if you have deep mastery of something, you can maybe apply it to the things you didn't think about. So when you go outside your box, and then also if you're curious about whatever it is and you have deep mastery of it, it's very satisfying for people to follow that.
Yeah, and that might be karate, or it might be flute, or it might be, I don't know. It doesn't have
poetry,
to be
canoeing, hairdressing, whatever it is.
Whatever it is.
In fact, the weirder the better, maybe. Great. Well, on that note, I would like to thank you very much. It's been an amazing chat.
That's great, absolutely great, Ben. Thank you so much for asking me to do it.
Thank you. If you appreciate the show, please like and subscribe, as it helps others find the podcast.